impressed by Raouf Halaby is not only his intellect, but his passionate commitment to the wide and deep love of God that is informed by the fact that he knows God's love as a world traveler. As you know from looking at the very, very thumbnail sketch of Raouf's biography that's in your bulletin, and I do say very, very thumbnail because his bio can go for pages. Raouf was born in Jerusalem. I like to refer to that as Palestine. I like to refer to it because Raouf immigrated to Lebanon after his father passed away with his mother and his brother, and Raouf has been, as I see it, part of that great number of people who have the, let's say, the burden of having been displaced but not being able to go back home and claim home. Because we read about the Israeli-Palestinian thing, and for us it's news. For Raouf, it's personal history. And he understands the grace and love of God from that perspective. I think it's important that we who are followers of Jesus learn to appreciate God's grace from that perspective. And I think it's especially important for those of us who often hear the grace of God proclaimed by people who say themselves evangelicals, to know that the grace of God is not discriminatory. It does not displace, it affirms. It does not uproot, it grounds, and it welcomes. I'm glad for Raouf Halaby to be here because he is a living witness to that grace. And I wanted Raouf Halaby to be here because he brings a message about that grace. And not only personally, but he's a wonderful writer. I read his stuff on Counterpoint. I read Raouf. I follow him. I'm accused of reading too much. And my burden is I don't have enough time to read all the good stuff Raouf writes. Raouf is here with his wonderful wife, Rachel. They are both educators. Raouf is retired from 42 years of teaching at Washington, and Rachel is retired from being a gifted and talented teacher at Arkansas Public Schools. And they are also travelers, and therefore my wife-in-law enjoys them because they traveled recently together. They're hot friends now with equally stamped passports. After music from Cindy and Barbara, Raouf Halaby, my friend and God's servant, will come and proclaim the truth from the gospel that God has given him to share. I ask you to be prayerful for and with him as he does so. I have assured him that we are friendly people. I have assured him that he need not be uncomfortable. I know you will remind him by your smiles and by your affirmation that I did not lie. Amen. If I say anything,
I love you, brother.
If I say anything wrong, please forgive me.
Oh, Thank you very much for wonderful, wonderful expression of faith. It is so great to use one's talents to praise God in this fashion. When Judge Griffin invited me to deliver this morning's message, I promptly told him that instead of delivering a sermon, I will be speaking with you. And let me assure you that there is a certain amount, if not a lot of trepidation on my part. For a long while now, I have been attending and listening to your outstanding sermons, Judge, albeit through emails. There is just no way that I will ever be able to fill your shoes, Judge, both physically and metaphorically. You are truly a giant of a man. And I would like to tell Ray Higgins, an outstanding shepherd of the faith, for being here. Cindy and I attended Washita at the same time, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Cindy, I think. And Patricia, what a pleasure to see you again. We rested and we had an outstanding experience traveling, and I wish we had more time to get to know her, but there will be time in the future. Amen. I will be speaking to you about the following topic: who is my neighbor? The scripture is replete with passages that draw attention to the plight of neighbors, strangers, refugees, and immigrants. I'm going to read a few passages from the Bible, and to expedite and take less time, I will just read the passages without references. For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Right. Therefore, I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother and to the needy in thy land. Yeah. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. And I was in prison, and you came to me. Truly I say unto you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. For where your treasure is, there will your heart also be. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? And then the last passage, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So, who is my neighbor? Is my neighbor the person who lives next door? Is my neighbor the family that lives across the street? Or maybe the senior citizens who live 3 or 4 houses down? Perhaps my neighbor is the disabled woman at the end of the street or in a nursing home. Or perhaps it is the young widow who lives across town or across the county line. Could my neighbor also be the person who lives in another town or a neighboring state? Could my neighbors be the disabled veteran and his young family? Or could it possibly be that a neighbor is someone I've never met? A person or persons, call them strangers, call them undocumented immigrants, or call them refugees, human beings who live in another part of the world, whose linguistic patterns, cultural mores, political system, and traditions differ from our own. Most real estate agents seem to stress to prospective home buyers that location, location, and location are the 3 most important guidelines in purchasing a home. Drilled in our heads is the notion that we Middle-class folks must purchase a home because it is the best investment we could make. And therefore, location is of paramount importance. Put another way, the inference here is that location is a euphemism for a stable neighborhood that has decent schools, a neighborhood that is quiet and safe, a neighborhood where the police are friendly, a neighborhood that has well-manicured lawns, 3-car garages flanked by 2-story houses whose Palladian windows betray a kind of exclusivity that is the envy of the less fortunate folks. Location, therefore, becomes a demarcation line, a pernicious line where gated communities, these islands of opulence, separate the haves from the have-nots, a kind of metaphorical chalk line whose intention it is to segregate, to divide, and to maintain a status quo. This same separation, unfortunately, exists between nations that are rich and nations that are poor. Hallmark movies and made-for-TV special programs that celebrate Christmas and Thanksgiving seasons, and we're going to see a bunch of these programs, have a tendency to capitalize and idealize familial love at Thanksgiving and Christmas in ways that are perhaps far removed from reality. A kind of Thomas Kincaid glossy painting in which a home is depicted as a glorified, idyllic large cottage whose exterior is surrounded by glowing and most inviting lush vegetation. A wraparound porch fully furnished with quaint furniture. An interior space where the fireplace and hearth are the focal point. And an interior space that is abundantly decorated with a plethora of familiar mementos that create an intimately welcoming, warm, and inviting space. A place where one can only imagine the aromas of baked turkey, dressing, and all the trimmings. The reality is that these idealistic scenes conjure up false images where plenty is the norm, where comfort is the standard, and where nothing but a blissful atmosphere prevails. Unfortunately, dear congregation, the real world is so far removed from the fantasy world created by Hallmark, Thomas Kincaid, and the glossy seasonal Macy commercials that paint a most unrealistic picture of the real world in which we live. Aspiring politicians and prosperity preachers seem to be speaking to the Thomas Kincaid audiences, selling them snake oil by glossing over the hunger, deprivation, malnutrition, preventable diseases, poverty, substandard housing, unemployment, homelessness, the plight of the destitute, the down and out, these miserably unfortunate human rejects who are forgotten by the so-called American one-percenters and the economically rich Western societies who wear exceptionalism in a false and pious manner. And we are frequently told that our world is a world governed by Judeo-Christian values. Hence, we are exclusively blessed. In the 1930s, we saw examples of this intertwining of nationalism and religious zealotry, which led to one of the worst periods in human history. Between August 23 and August 31, 2005, an ugly monster descended with fury and vengeance on the Gulf Coast of the United States, leaving in its wake a gosh-awful pulverized terrain that triggered a tragedy of epic proportions. A tragedy so severe it laid squalid waste to man, beast, and landscape. Whole communities and neighborhoods lay helpless as foul ferocity toyed with them and uprooted them as though they were merely saltine cracker boxes. Anyone recall the tragically sordid comments made by televangelist Jim Baker, Rush Limbaugh, and their ilk in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina? God sent a hurricane, they asserted, to punish America for a laundry list of sins. In his wisdom, patience, and kindness, God did not punish the poor citizens of New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mississippi by sending devastation in the form of water, flooding, and destructive winds that forced tens of thousands, mostly poor people, mostly people of color in New Orleans, to become homeless and destitute. As far as I am concerned, this is a distorted Old Testament view of God that we actually put into our own explanation. A view where God is represented as a vengeful, angry, morbid, out of control, out to get you God. A view so opposite to the New Testament God. The New Testament, that new covenant, is a book in which God reveals himself through his Son, Jesus Christ, as the epitome of love, compassion, forgiveness, hope, peace, and kindness. And that is why we will not find narratives of vengeance, the glorification of war, and the killing of entire populations, communities, and neighborhoods in the New Testament. Instead of an eye for an eye, Jesus admonishes us to forgive and turn the other cheek. Only recently have Americans realized that George Bush the Younger's war against Iraq, waged under false pretenses, laid waste and bombed the most technologically advanced country in the region back to the Stone Age. 12 years later, we are left with over 1 million dead Iraqis, 5 million refugees just from Iraq, and a civil war that has not only dragged us into its fangs, but also a war that has spawned one of the most virulent fanaticism that has spread across North Africa and the entire Near East. Honesty demands that we acknowledge that we are responsible for the egregious events in the extended neighborhood called the Middle East and North Africa. While we delight in holding tyrants to account for their crimes against humanity, we give immunity to Americans who kill and maim human beings in myriad neighborhoods across the world. These same murderers are in the process of bankrupting, I repeat, bankrupting our country because of ill-advised adventures on behalf of corporate America and oil companies. Imagine with me if the $1.5 trillion, 1 billion, and I had to look this up because I didn't know how many zeros were in a billion or in a trillion. So 1 billion has 9 zeros. 1 trillion has 12 zeros. If that $1.5 trillion spent on the Iraq War had been spent here at home to buttress our falling bridges, improve our highways, create meaningful jobs that provide decent wages, and most significantly, build neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are safe, neighborhoods in which children can attend decent schools in safe environments. It is my understanding that there are over 17,000 security officers stationed coast to coast in our schools. This, in my opinion, is insane. It seems to me that by building a better society where neighborhoods provide dignity, security, opportunity, and hope, such militarized school environments would not be needed. And there is something seriously sad about arming our local police forces with military-style equipment.
Yeah.
Creating little Iraqs, little Afghanistans, and little Gazas in our midst is not only ill-advised, but it also pits citizen against citizen. Pits us against each other and against the government, thus destroying neighborhoods. Neighborhood location should be islands of serenity for all our citizens. And how often have we heard the following? Because we are a Christian nation, God has blessed us. Or, look at him. He is doing so well. God has blessed him. The corollary and inference to this is to view the unfortunate as ungodly. Even to the point of accusing God of inflicting a terminal disease or misfortune on individuals or nations because he, she, they must have done something bad. A kind of ancient, primitive, superstitious pagan way of viewing life. I'll never forget a note sent to Rachel and to me 31 years ago. At age 3, our younger son Ryan was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. A local friend, a well-meaning member of our church, sent us a note in which she observed the following. You two are too good for this to have happened to you. How do you respond to a genuinely good, yet sadly misinformed person? Especially at a time when one is trying to put the pieces together to deal with and to negotiate the next hour, the next day, the next week, and the next month in a world fraught with uncertainties. Instead of being angry at the 70-something-year-old lady, we chalked off the experience to have her contracted a dose of Calvinistic teaching. And to good intentions expressed in a most clumsy manner. A manner in which biblical text is misunderstood. Nowadays, Ryan is a happy-go-lucky 34-year-old who spreads sunshine far and near. Left with residual cognitive and fine motor challenges, today Ryan is gainfully employed as a grocery store sacker. He is one of the friendliest, kindest, most compassionate people I will ever have met. For 3 years in a row, Ryan was voted as the Clark County Grocery Sacker of the Year. And I can understand why. Ryan is a good neighbor to all the customers, especially the elderly and disabled. In neighborly fashion, he wheels customers' groceries to their cars and unloads the sacks in a manner that makes it easier for those afflicted with physical ailments or disabilities to unload their groceries. On more than one occasion, Ryan would, upon clocking out, head to the customer's house to help unload and or to deliver a large case of bottled water, soft drinks, or large sacks of dog food. One occasion stands out. Upon checking out, a disheveled-looking elderly lady pushed her grocery cart to the checkout counter, whereupon she discovered that she did not have sufficient funds. And I tell you, this happens very, very often. She asked the attendant to take out in increments, first the meat, then the fruit, then the milk, and several canned goods so as to reduce her bill to equal the amount of cash she held in her hand. Ryan nudged the cashier, reached into his billfold, and covered what the woman lacked. Thus, sending a neighbor he'd never met before home with all her needs to feed her family. There's no doubt in my mind that Ryan practices his neighborliness on a daily basis. When, in the aftermath of April 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, the two perpetrators were identified as brothers born to Muslim parents in Kyrgyzstan, two elderly customers, a husband and wife, pointedly asked Ryan the following question: "You look like the Muslim terrorists in Boston. Are you their brother? Are you related to them?" Just because Ryan has a slightly pigmented complexion, and just because his handsome features are more Near Eastern than Billy Bob Bubba features, doesn't mean that he might be a terrorist. This misinformed couple, no doubt, watches Fox News. And they, I will have to tell you, are the exception rather than the rule. And just because a person is a person of color, whether black, Hispanic, or Asian, or even a person who is mainstream white but is not affluent, doesn't mean that these people should be followed and stalked in a store, stopped while driving a car, questioned for no apparent reason, and viewed with suspicion only because their facial features, the way they are dressed, or the color of their skins. Let me share this incident that occurred in the summer of 2014 in New York City. Camila Brock, a young Jamaican-American woman, was ticketed while driving her BMW in Harlem. Her car impounded. She was told to come to the station the following day to pay the fine and claim her car. Told that the car was not hers, she argued that, as a bank employee, indeed the car was hers. She was whisked off in an ambulance to a mental institution where she was sedated, evaluated, and kept for 8 days. Then she was released. Adding insult to injury, she was billed $13,600 by the psychiatric institution. You see, Camila could not have owned that car because she did not look like a white middle-class person. I went actually on Snopes to verify this incident. For the arresting officers, Camila's skin color meant that she could not have been employed by a bank. And actually, there's more to the story. She told them that she was on Twitter with President Obama. And in fact, it turned out that she was on Twitter with President Obama, along with some 600,000 other people. But it was somebody else who was actually doing the Twittering for the president. And yet, again, I think that there's something ironic about this, because most people who are Twittering with the president think that he is Twittering back, whereas there is a ghost somewhere in the basement of the White House Twittering back and forth. Okay, the arresting officers and all those involved can hardly be called neighbors. And sadly, what we've witnessed in the last 2 years prompts me to say that Martin Luther King's vision, uttered in August of 1963, just over 50 years ago, and in spite of all the progress American society has made, has not yet been realized. I have a dream, Dr. King told the whole world, that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And on this, we must keep working. Back to Ryan for just a minute. On the bright side, recently Ryan has taught me the meaning of what it means to be a neighbor and to love the stranger. Unbeknownst to us, Ryan has adopted and committed himself to having $30 per month drafted from his checking account to help a young orphan in Haiti. In view of myriad scams that prey on the goodness of unsuspecting decent people, I implored Ryan to reconsider, pointing out that he works only 5 to 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, if he is that lucky, earning minimum wage. Undeterred, and as proof, Ryan shared a picture of a 3-year-old Haitian child, a picture one has to believe is a bona fide image of a Haitian child. Dad, Ryan told me, firmly and with full conviction, this boy depends on me. I can't let him down. How would he feel if I just deserted him and stopped supporting him? Even though I still have very serious doubts about the merits of this particular charity, Ryan won, hands down. I must tell you that in a world where heroes are scarce, Ryan is at the top of my list of heroes. He is a hero par excellence. His neighborhood extends beyond the Arkadelphia city limits, all the way to an impoverished country on a different continent. For him, there are no strangers, but only fellow human beings, better known as neighbors. So, let me return to the question of who is my neighbor. I think all of us recall the serious tragedy that has been unfolding in the Aegean Sea. We spent last Labor Day weekend enjoying water skiing, picnicking, camping, driving large SUVs thanks to $2 per gallon gasoline. While children and adults in the Middle East were drowning. Kim Davis, the Kentucky clerk who refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, and Mike Huckabee, her shining knight in pious armor, were the lead stories in America. While Huckabee's pretense at being a good neighbor was a made-for-television stunt, to the best of my recollection, I have not heard the former governor, a professed Southern Baptist preacher, express concern for our immigrants or for the hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing a war in the Near East, a war, ironically, he wholeheartedly supports and justifies. As for American politicians, over the same weekend, they delivered a host of hateful speeches, appealing to vile, xenophobic, and self-aggrandizing rhetoric. Like a truant criminal, they took immigration and personified it, whipping it, and beating up on immigrants. Yeah. Donald Trump and his like-minded cohorts insist a wall must be built on our southern border. A permanent wall, he says, so high it would seal the United States. And if any of you watched Saturday Night Live last night, there was a little spoof about the Mexican president and Donald Trump was there in person, giving him a check and saying, "This is the check for building the wall." I mean, it's for me, yes, there is humor in it, but it's actually dark humor. Anyway, so by referring to the refugees as swarms, this is what British Prime Minister David Cameron said. He slipped an egregiously despicable Freudian statement. Swarms is a term most often used to refer to pesky insects.
Yes.
Hornets, wasps, roaches, and ants, a flying, creepy, and crawly species to be swatted and exterminated with guided and cruise missiles. His Freudian slip betrays a deep-rooted 19th century British notions of superiority. A journalist said, Britain has lost its moral compass. And of course, the photograph of the limp 4-year-old child, Aylan Kurdi, who drowned, finally made the world aware of the tragedy of the refugees. And the text for today, which, by the way, I had here, and Judge, you put it in the bulletin, but as a preface to it, I think it's interesting that there was a religious lawyer who was attempting to trick Jesus into committing a religious faux pas, a mistake so serious that Jesus would be discredited. The man's question was actually very ethnocentric. What is written in the law? Who is my neighbor? He wanted to know what defines a neighbor. And of course, Jesus was not embarrassed. The gentleman attempted to expose him as a lover of Gentiles, a crime against the established religious order. You know, the parable is a wonderful literary device. Yeah. And Jesus was not only a preacher. He preached with stories. Yeah. And my favorite parable happens to be the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I have a personal connection to Jericho. Around the turn of the last century, my grandfather contracted a portion of the Jericho to Jerusalem road. And the old road, went by what is believed to be the Inn of the Good Samaritan. Jericho was a place where my family sought refuge after the War of 1948. Jericho was the road on which we headed back to Jerusalem, to our hometown. Jericho, of course, is about neighbors. It is all about neighbors. Yes. And you think about it, the Samaritan was an outcast. In that society, Samaritans were defiled people. Yes. You know, when I was a child in Jerusalem, I remember we would go to the marketplace, and mother would buy the vegetables, and these Jewish merchants, she couldn't put the money in their hand because they didn't want to touch her. And so they would point to the scales where she would put the money. And they would put the change then in that same, the scale, I guess you can call it a pan that you can take off. And this is how she got the change back. The groceries the sacks were never handed to her, rather they were placed. Why? She's a Palestinian. She's a Christian. So that same mentality existed during the times of Christ. And the Good Samaritan actually did something that was so noble. Not only did he tend to the wounds, but he took him to the inn. Yeah. And he said, here is some money to cover the expenses. I think I'd like to point out, as a way to try to bring it to a close, to say the following. What we saw in Europe has really brought out the best and the worst in humanity. Right. The worst, we saw it in Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia, Poland, refusing admission to the refugees. Right. In Hungary, for example, on the trains, the refugees were picked up and put in holding camps. Right. How sad the Hungarians forgot what happened to them during World War II. That's right. Some of the soldiers donned gloves and put on masks when they dealt with the refugees. You don't want to touch these disease, pestilence. Some call them Muslim pestilence. There was a journalist who actually tripped a young teenager, a teenage girl, deliberately and maliciously. Yes. And as soon as she did that, she ran to a father who was holding his child and tripped him and pushed him on the ground. Thank goodness these events were caught on, on camera. Right. So this was the ugly side. There were a lot of other ugly things by leaders and individuals and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, there were a lot of absolutely wonderful things. Right. Germans standing there crying, holding toys, providing food and water and clothing. His Holiness Pope Francis calling on all Catholic or parishes to adopt a family, a refugee family. In our state, Ray was active in raising funds to provide for the immigrants and the destitute. So there are good Samaritans in this world. There is no doubt. And to bring it to a conclusion, I want to end with a brief story, an uplifting story. It's about two dogs. They are Tilly and Phoebe. Their devotion to each other is gratifying. An Irish setter, Tilly's act of kindness and dedication to her Basset Hound friend, Phoebe, is a modern-day parable worthy of emulation by a depraved humanity. Basset Hound Phoebe wandered off into the woods and fell into a neighboring shallow cistern from which she could not emerge. Trapped for a week, Phoebe's companion would not desert her friend. According to the reporter, neighboring property owners saw the reddish Tilly repeatedly appear on the scene and then disappear back into the ravine. A week later, someone reported these sightings to a local animal rescue center, whereupon Phoebe, thanks only to the steadfast vigilance and loyalty of her friend, was saved. What a lesson we can learn from two dogs. So, who is my neighbor? Luke tells us at the end of the parable, Jesus posed the following rhetorical question: which now of these three thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? His response was very simple: go ye and do likewise. May we go and do likewise. God bless you.